They weren't supposed to be here. Not on this side of the ice. Not before the glaciers melted. And certainly not as the founders of thousands of cultures that would one day stretch from the Arctic tundra to the Amazon rainforest. But science has a strange way of catching up to what oral histories have whispered all along. Thousands of years before the pyramids, before the rise of Rome, before the first Chinese dynasties, a small group of humans stood alone in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, the Ice Age corridor between Siberia and what is now Alaska. This was not a mere crossing point. It was a place of waiting, of becoming. Beringia, a lost land, now buried under the Bering Sea, that once connected Asia to North America like a frozen umbilical cord. For millennia, sea levels had dropped, exposing vast grasslands, a refuge amid the ice. But what the textbooks once called a bridge was no brief passage. New genetic evidence shows that these early humans didn't just pass through Beringia. They stayed, for thousands of years. This standstill, as scientists now call it, wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation. Trapped between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, cut off from their Asian relatives, the Beringian people began to change. Their DNA began accumulating mutations not seen anywhere else on Earth. One of them, a peculiar genetic pattern called the 9-repeat allele, became a silent signature passed down from those Ice Age survivors to every indigenous population from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. It's a marker no other humans carry. Not Europeans, not East Asians, only the descendants of Beringia. And that changes everything, because it means that before they spread across the Americas, before they hunted mammoths on the plains or built ceremonial mounds in the Mississippi, the ancestors of all Native Americans shared a common beginning. A cold, lonely genesis that forged a lineage unique in human history. This wasn't a random migration. It was a crucible. Genetic studies now date this period of isolation to roughly 23,000 years ago, during the height of the last glacial maximum. And it wasn't short. For nearly 6,000 years, these people lived in environmental limbo, neither in Asia, nor quite in America. Archaeology remains scarce from this period, but their genes? Their genes remember. Then something shifted. The ice began to thaw. Pathways opened, first along the Pacific coast, later through inland corridors. And from that frozen bottleneck, an expansion began. A single ancestral population, once numbering in the low hundreds, would multiply and spread with astonishing speed, filling 2 continents in a matter of centuries. But that comes later in our story. Right now, we sit with them in the silence of Beringia. Imagine it. Endless windswept plains, herds of woolly mammoths grazing in twilight, children born under an Arctic moon. These are the people whose DNA still beats in the blood of modern Native Americans, whose genetic code carries the memory of firelight, hunger, endurance. They were never lost. We simply weren't listening. Their beginning wasn't the edge of a land bridge. It was the beginning of a world. The first time scientists realized just how fast the first Americans moved, it broke their models. Monte Verde, Chile, 14,600 years ago. A site so far south, so impossibly early, that it shattered the belief that Clovis culture was the first in the Americas. This wasn't a fringe discovery. This was a torch thrown into the dry kindling of outdated theory. But how did people arrive there so soon, when massive glaciers still cloaked the north? Here's where genetics cuts through the fog. When researchers sequenced the genome of a 12,600-year-old child buried in Montana, the Anzac, one infant, what they found sent a shockwave through archaeology. This child, laid to rest with carved antlers and red ochre, was genetically closer to indigenous peoples of Central and South America than to many modern North American tribes. Wait, what? How could a child in Ice Age Montana share more ancestry with tribes thousands of miles south than with their neighbors? Because the first wave wasn't slow. It was explosive. After thousands of years in frozen isolation, the people of Beringia didn't trickle into the continent. They surged down the Pacific coast, following a corridor of kelp and ice-free shores. It wasn't a land slog. It was seafaring, shore-hugging, swift migration. They reached the southern tip of the Americas in mere centuries, not millennia. What if we told you the entire hemisphere, from Alaska to Argentina, was populated in less than 2,000 years. Not by armies, not by conquest, but by kin groups, storytellers, fire keepers. Their genome carries the evidence. Today, all indigenous populations, from the Cree of Canada to the Mapuche of Chile, share threads of this original lineage. One wave, one founding burst. But here's where it gets strange again. That single wave split. Geneticists found a fork in the lineage. One ancestral branch that stayed largely in the north, and another that radiated into the heart of the Americas and beyond. This wasn't just geographic drift. It was divergence under pressure. Different climates, different diets, different challenges. You see it in the diversity of languages, in the shapes of tools, in the bones themselves. But why does this matter? Because for decades, scientists debated whether multiple populations entered the Americas at different times. A Paleo-American group, they argued, had different skull shapes, more in common with Australomelanesians. That theory now lies in ruins. The DNA doesn't lie. Ancient genomes from every corner of the Americas, even the so-called Paleo-American remains, tie back to that same first wave. The theory of separate origins has been replaced with something far more powerful: unity through variation. One ancestral root, branching into a continent of cultures. But it wasn't all one-way traffic. Have you heard about the genetic boomerang? Some Native American DNA shows up back in Siberia. Around 11,000 years ago, long after the initial migration, genes flowed from the Americas to Asia. Hunter-gatherers didn't just arrive, they explored, returned, traded, maybe even loved across continents. This isn't the static prehistory we were taught. This is movement, memory, migration, written into mitochondrial lines and Y-DNA markers. A restless, brilliant species finding its way into the world. And here's a question you may not have asked yet. Why does a child's genome from Montana match someone's great-grandmother in Peru? Because blood remembers what maps forget. Because long before borders, before tribes were given names by colonizers, there was kinship without lines. And that's what the first wave reveals, not just the route of migration, but the rhythm of it. Fast, fluid, full of purpose. So next time someone asks where the first Americans came from, don't point to a map. Point to a story. One carried in every indigenous heartbeat, from Nunavut to Patagonia. Because the first wave never ended. It became a world. In the heart of the Amazon rainforest, far from the Bering Strait, far from any coastal migration route, scientists found something that should not exist. It wasn't an artifact. It wasn't a tool. It was a whisper in the blood. Deep inside the genomes of indigenous tribes like the Surue and Kurishana, researchers uncovered a small but unmistakable signal that matched Australians. Yes, Australians. Or more precisely, a ghostly genetic connection to indigenous Australians, Melanesians, and the Andamanese Islanders, people who have been isolated in the South Pacific for tens of thousands of years. So how did their signature end up in the DNA of people living in the Amazon jungle? This wasn't contamination. It wasn't a lab mistake. The signal was too clean, too ancient. They called it population Y. Y for the unknown. A mysterious ancestral thread embedded in South American genomes, but absent everywhere else in the Americas. It's as if a shadow population walked into the Amazon and vanished, leaving nothing but a genetic footprint. But who were they? Some suggest a lost migration, a group that branched off from the ancestors of Australomelanesians and somehow reached South America before the first Americans arrived. A trans-Pacific crossing, tens of thousands of years ago. Sounds impossible. But is it? Others argue it wasn't a separate migration at all, just a remnant of an ancient group in East Asia, distantly related to Australians, that mixed with the ancestors of Native Americans before they ever left Siberia. Either way, the data stands. There is something in the genome that we didn't expect, a signal that breaks the model, a trace of someone long gone, yet still present. Think about what that means. We're not just talking about known tribes. We're talking about ancestors of ancestors, lineages that left no bones, no language, no artifacts, only molecules. And it gets stranger. The population Y signal is concentrated in the Amazon, not in the north, where early migration supposedly began. Why? Did this ghost group sail down the Pacific, enter South America directly, and settle in the jungle, bypassing the North altogether? Or did they arrive with a founding population, only to survive in one isolated branch? Every answer opens a new door. Now imagine being a young Amazonian indigenous person who takes part in a DNA study and learns their ancestors might be linked, distantly, to people on the other side of the planet. What would that do to your sense of identity? Science rarely confronts questions of memory, of mythology. But here it has no choice. Because the genetics don't lie. Population Y has now been confirmed by multiple independent teams. And while it makes up only a tiny fraction, less than 2% of the genome, it's enough to force a rethinking of human migration. A flaw in the migration map that can't be erased. And here's the twist. Later reviews of ancient genomes suggest that the population Y signal didn't come after the first wave. It might have been there before, a whisper woven into the founding population, long before they ever touched the Americas. So maybe this isn't a story of separate migrations, but of a single group carrying the memory of many. The real mystery? No known ancient skeleton carries this signature yet. It exists only in the living. A missing population, a silent partner in the birth of the Americas, whose bones we've never found, but whose blood still sings in the rainforest. What else are we missing? What secrets still lie dormant in the DNA of the world's most remote peoples? And if this much can be hidden in just 2%, what's in the rest? What if your ancestors didn't just survive their environment, but rewrote their own biology to master it? Long before Western science invented the word adaptation, native peoples across the Americas were already evolving, not metaphorically, but genetically. Their bodies were responding to altitude, temperature, diet, and scarcity in ways modern medicine is only beginning to understand. Start with the Andes. At over 13,000 feet above sea level, the air is so thin it can suffocate the unprepared. But for indigenous island communities like the Quechua and Aymara, this is home. Not a temporary struggle, a permanent biological condition. So how did their bodies cope? Their genes changed, but not in the way scientists expected. Unlike Tibetans, whose bodies make less hemoglobin to compensate, Andean natives evolved the opposite. Higher oxygen saturation, larger lung capacity, and red blood cells packed with hemoglobin. It's like having a built-in oxygen tank stitched into your DNA. No other human population adapted quite like this. Now shift north, way north, to the Arctic. The Inuit, facing brutal cold and a diet rich in seal fat and whale blubber, exhibit genetic variants that regulate fat metabolism differently from any other known group. Genes like FADS and TBX15 don't just help them process marine oils. They protect their internal organs from freezing damage and help convert food into heat. Can you imagine a diet that would cripple most humans, actually becoming the fuel that keeps a population alive? But that's not all. In the dry plateaus, rainforest edges, and even deserts, different groups were adapting in parallel. Over generations, their DNA began encoding not just survival, but local mastery. And here's where it gets personal. Modern descendants still carry these adaptations. And in some cases, those once life-saving mutations now complicate things. Have you ever wondered why some native communities struggle with hypertension at sea level, or with obesity when shifting to Western diets? It's not lifestyle alone, it's biological mismatch. Genes shaped by thousands of years in extreme environments are suddenly forced to operate in modern, sedentary, high-calorie contexts they were never built for. It's like asking a snow leopard to thrive in the tropics. The code is wrong for the climate. But perhaps the most incredible part? Some adaptations have no clear function yet. In multiple native groups, scientists have identified DNA regions with strong signs of natural selection, but they don't yet know what those genes do. We're looking at living people whose ancestors evolved tools we still haven't decoded. What do you do with a mystery like that? And how do you tell the story of a people whose survival strategy was written directly into their blood? Ask the Pima of Arizona, whose ancestors navigated deserts by evolving extraordinary efficiency in water retention and energy storage. In the past, it kept them alive through famine. Today, it contributes to some of the highest rates of type 2 diabetes in the world. A gift turned burden, a code turned curse. It forces us to ask, when does adaptation stop helping? When does biology, designed for one world, begin to betray us in another? These aren't abstract questions. They define healthcare realities across native nations today. And the answers? They're still hiding in the helix. What makes this so haunting isn't just the data. It's the realization that ancient people didn't just adapt once. They kept evolving, shaped by every mountain, every glacier, every drought. The land wrote itself into their bodies. And today, those bodies still carry the echo of wind, fire, ice, and time. Imagine carrying a genetic legacy, so ancient it once protected your ancestors from starvation, only to find it's now pushing your community toward an epidemic. That's the brutal paradox woven into the DNA of many native peoples, a paradox scientists didn't fully understand until they stared into a single gene, SLC16A11. When this gene variant was discovered, it was a revelation. Found in nearly half of Indigenous Americans, and also prevalent in Latino populations with native ancestry, it dramatically increases the risk of type 2 diabetes. But here's the twist. This wasn't always a weakness. Thousands of years ago, in a world of scarcity and uncertainty, this mutation helped conserve energy, store fat, survive harsh winters and failed harvests. Today, that same thriftiness turns deadly in the age of processed food, sugar overload, and nutritional disconnection. Can a gene turn on you? Can survival mechanisms become time bombs? The answer is yes. And this is just one example. Now let's talk about blood. Across pre-contact Native American populations, type O blood was overwhelmingly dominant, nearly 100%, a rare homogeneity in human genetics. But blood types aren't just labels, they influence disease susceptibility. People with type O blood have reduced risk for heart disease and malaria, but they're also more vulnerable to infections like Helicobacter pylori, a bacterium that causes ulcers and stomach cancer. And when smallpox, measles, and influenza crashed into the Americas in the 1500s, this lack of immunological variety had catastrophic consequences. It wasn't just that these diseases were foreign. Native immune systems, shaped in isolation for over 15,000 years, had never met such microbial monsters. The result? Populations collapsed. Some scholars estimate up to 90% mortality in some regions. Not through war, through biology. But here's the part no one talks about. This devastation wasn't the result of genetic inferiority. It was the consequence of being too well adapted to a different world. What would happen if you took someone evolved for an ice age and dropped them into the Industrial Revolution overnight? Because that's exactly what colonization did. It didn't just erase cultures. It rewrote the evolutionary context. And it left scars not just on landscapes, but in chromosomes. In the Pacific Northwest, researchers found that nearly half the Haida population carries HLA, B27, an immune allele strongly linked to autoimmune disorders like ankylosing spondylitis. That's one of the highest frequencies in the world. Coincidence? Not likely. These immune system quirks probably once protected against specific pathogens, or conferred survival advantages in isolated communities. But in today's interconnected, urbanized world, they can trigger chronic pain and lifelong disability. Even rare genetic disorders have emerged from this crucible of survival and isolation. Navajo neurohepatopathy, a devastating childhood disease found almost exclusively in certain DNA clans, traced back to a mutation in the MPV17 gene, or the Pueblo-specific variant of cystic fibrosis, a mutation not found in European carriers of the disease. What do these rare diseases tell us? That Native American DNA is not just different, it is distinct, shaped by bottlenecks, environment, and thousands of years of isolation. And ignoring that distinctiveness in medicine can mean misdiagnoses, mistreatment, or worse. Have you ever wondered why Native communities are often excluded from genetic studies? It's not a coincidence. It's a failure, one that perpetuates health disparities and leaves doctors guessing when their patients don't fit the model built on European genomes. But the tide is turning. From precision medicine projects to native-led research initiatives, there's a growing movement to bring indigenous DNA into the center of medical science, not as an afterthought, but as a foundation for inclusion, ethics, and healing. Because these aren't just genes. They're the residues of fires lit in ancient camps, the fingerprints of survival across extinction events, the molecular echoes of thousands of ancestors who adapted, endured, and passed down a code built for their world, not ours. The question now is, will we finally build a medical system that listens? Or will the hidden wisdom in native DNA continue to be misunderstood or ignored? Not every betrayal leaves a scar you can see. Some are buried in lab reports, locked behind institutional doors, hidden in frozen vials labeled with names that were never meant to be studied. That's exactly what happened to the Havasupai. In the early 1990s, this small Native American tribe agreed to provide DNA samples to researchers, hoping to better understand the high rates of diabetes affecting their people. But instead of limiting the study, scientists used their genetic material to investigate schizophrenia, inbreeding, and even ancient human migration, all without permission, no consultation, no informed consent. When the truth surfaced, it wasn't just a legal issue. It was a violation of cultural sovereignty, of sacred trust. So the Havasupai took their case to court and won. But the damage had already been done. Across Native America, a new wave of suspicion took root. DNA was no longer just science. It was a weapon of extraction. Which raises the question, who controls indigenous DNA? Who decides what can be done with it? Who benefits? This isn't just theoretical. It affects everything, from medical research to ancestry testing to the preservation of identity itself. And it's not ancient history. Even today, some genetic studies continue to treat indigenous DNA as an anonymous resource, a raw material to be mined in the name of discovery. But native nations are fighting back, not with protests, with policy. Enter the age of indigenous data sovereignty, the principle that native communities have the absolute right to govern the collection, use, and ownership of any data about them, including genetic data. No more helicopter research. No more taking samples and disappearing. Now, tribes are building their own ethical review boards, setting their own rules, controlling their own stories. Have you heard of the CARE principles? They stand for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. A framework that flips the script, putting indigenous priorities at the center of all research. Because DNA isn't just code. In native cultures, it's kinship, it's spirit. Sometimes it's ceremony. You don't extract it. You respect it. And this new era of resistance is not about rejecting science. It's about reshaping it. Take the Native Biodata Consortium. Founded and led by indigenous scientists, it's the first tribal-run biorepository in the U.S. Its mission: to collect, store, and protect native genetic material on native terms. It's about more than samples. It's about trust, about survival, about future generations deciding what their biology will mean. Imagine if someone took your grandmother's bones and ran tests on them without ever asking your family. That's what's happened repeatedly to native communities across North and South America. But no more. From the Arctic to the Amazon, indigenous leaders are reclaiming control over their data, demanding transparency, and asking the world to understand that genomes are not property. They are people. They are history. They are sovereignty. So the next time a research paper cites anonymous indigenous genomes, ask this. Were those communities asked? Were they partners, or just subjects? Because until science answers those questions with humility and honesty, no amount of discovery can be called progress. This isn't just about ethics. It's about justice written in nucleotides, and the right to say no. There's a question people love to ask after they get their DNA results. Does this mean I'm Native American? But the real answer? It can't be downloaded. Because heritage doesn't come from an algorithm. It comes from the stories that raised you. In recent years, millions have spit into plastic tubes, mailed off their identity, and waited for a percentage to define them. 3%, 12%, maybe even just 0.6%. But the number they get back isn't truth. It's a statistical guess, built on incomplete reference data and genetic noise. So what does it actually mean when a test says Indigenous Americas? Sometimes nothing at all. Commercial tests look for segments of your genome that resemble known native DNA. But resemble is not the same as belong. And most of these companies don't have access to real tribal reference genomes. Why? Because many native nations refuse to contribute to databases that commodify their ancestry without consent. So, when you see a result labeled native, you're looking at a shadow, not a bloodline. And yet, some use that shadow to make claims. Claims to identity. Claims to heritage. Sometimes, even claims to tribal enrollment. But here's what many don't realize. Every tribe in the U.S. and Canada sets its own citizenship criteria. And they don't use percentages from 23andMe. They use documents, community ties, lineal descent traced to specific ancestors on tribal rolls, often going back a century or more. It's not just about DNA. It's about belonging. Because being native isn't just about who you descend from. It's about who raised you, who you stand with, who you're accountable to. Ask any tribal elder. They'll tell you. You don't become native by clicking share results. You become native by showing up to ceremony, to council, to community. And yes, there are people with native blood who've been disconnected through adoption, displacement, colonization. For them, DNA tests may be a starting point, a spark, but never the whole fire. So where do we draw the line between curiosity and appropriation? That's the ethical fault line no commercial test wants to talk about. In one corner, people trying to reclaim lost identity. In the other, people trying to borrow one for personal gain. And the consequences are real. Tribes have had to defend their membership roles against false claims. Scholarships, grants, leadership roles, all jeopardized when genetic percentages are mistaken for lived reality. Even the U.S. government, in rare cases, has accepted genetic evidence in federal recognition petitions, sparking backlash from indigenous communities who say, "Our identity is not up for sale." So what role should genetics play? At its best, DNA can offer clues, confirm family stories, connect relatives, guide research, but it cannot replace the deeper truth held in genealogy, oral history, and communal memory. Think of it like this. Genetics is the echo. Genealogy is the voice. And unless you know how to listen to both, you're only hearing half the story. If you're on a journey to discover indigenous roots, start with respect. Talk to the communities you think you descend from. Ask what matters to them, not what's convenient for you. Because in the end, being native isn't a result. It's a responsibility.